Sometimes in the name of science or in the name of national security, governments do things that are, well, just horrifying. We're going to take a look into the shadows of state-sponsored human experimentation, comparing what happened in Nazi Germany with similar programs right in the United States. We'll explore who was targeted, what they were forced to endure, and the devastating consequences that are still being felt today.
Just try to imagine that for a second. That's how one American soldier described something called the drop test. It was a routine procedure where they'd place a single drop of liquid mustard agent right on his bare arm. Within hours, it would erupt into these huge, incredibly painful blisters. And what's so chilling is that this was just one of many, many experiments that were eerily similar, happening on opposite sides of the world for reasons that were startlingly alike. So the first and most obvious question is who? Who were the people subjected to this? And in both Germany and the US, a really disturbing pattern starts to show up. A pattern of targeting the most vulnerable people, those with the fewest rights. When you put the populations side by side like this, the parallels are just unsettling. I mean, we're talking about vastly different governments, right? But look at the groups they both went after. Prisoners, conscientious objectors, and, unbelievably, even mentally disabled children. In Nazi Germany, the subjects were mainly people the state had labeled subhuman. The experiments were carried out in concentration camps like Ashwitz and Dau. They used Jewish, Polish, Soviet, and gypsy prisoners, men, women, and even children, as completely unwilling test subjects. Now, over in the United States, the pool of subjects was a bit more varied, but no less troubling. You had over 6,000 soldiers who, yes, volunteered, but often without any real idea of the risks. You had conscientious objectors, prison inmates being used for skin tests, and even ordinary civilians like the 102 Alaskan natives who were given radioactive iodine with absolutely zero medical follow-up. Okay, so we know who they targeted. Now let's get into what was tested. This is where we look at the terrifying list of substances and methods used in these experiments, where the goal of military advantage just completely overshadowed any sense of humanity. Nazi doctors performed some truly brutal experiments. At Dachau, prisoners were plunged into ice water for hours to test ways to rewarm pilots. In another horrific test, a group of gypsy prisoners were forced to drink only seawater. They became so desperately dehydrated, they were seen licking freshly mopped floors, just trying to get a single drop of fresh water. And this wasn't some abstract thing. It was personal. Listen to this from a survivor of Dr. Mengele's experiments at Auschwitz. They talk about getting injections of God knows what, causing horrible fevers and violent sickness, all while being subjected to endless, invasive measurements, never having a clue what was actually being pumped into their bodies. At the exact same time, American service members were breathing in their own cocktail of chemicals. At places like Fort McClellan, soldiers were ordered to stand in these thick clouds of petroleum smoke, and they were exposed to nerve agent stimulants that caused immediate, awful reactions, things like seizures and vomiting they couldn't control. The history of these chemical weapons is a story in itself. Take the nerve agent sarin. It was first created in Nazi Germany back in 1938. Fast forward just a little over a decade, and the U.S. Army is testing that exact same agent on its own soldiers. That program ran for 20 years before it was finally shut down in scandal. So this all leads to a really big question. How? How were these experiments justified, not just to the public, but to the people taking part? And more importantly, what was the long-term human cost? Well, in the U.S., the magic word was national security. A 1976 Senate report basically spelled it out. The government decided that individual rights were less important than national security. That was the excuse used for all the secrecy, for not getting real, informed consent, and for completely neglecting any kind of follow-up medical care. And on paper, it all looked official. In the U.S., participation was technically voluntary. Soldiers would sign these official-looking documents, just like this volunteer participation agreement, giving their consent. But the real question is, what did that signature actually mean? The truth is, it was an illusion. A 1975 government report confirmed that volunteers were not fully informed of the risks. Get this, some guys only found out what they were given, like LSD, 30 years after the fact. For others, the results were just tragic. One man's father took his own life after a test, and his family never knew why until it was too late. And for thousands of these American veterans, the experiment never really ended. The long-term effects have been absolutely devastating. We're talking about a lifetime of health problems, chronic nerve damage, serious respiratory diseases, different kinds of cancers, and severe psychological issues, all traced back to what they were exposed to. And that brings us to the final, and maybe the most infuriating part of this whole story, the massive shadow cast by decades of official secrecy, a secrecy that continues to hide the full truth even now. So the U.S. government has an official number. They've identified 7,120 Army and Air Force personnel who took part in chemical and biological tests at places like Edgewood Arsenal. But, and this is a huge but, that number is not the whole story. Not even close. A 2004 report from the Government Accountability Office basically said that because of all the secrecy and how informal these programs were, we'll probably never know the true total of people who were exposed. For 40 years, think about that, 40 years, the Pentagon flat out denied that programs like Project Ph0d even existed. This wall of silence didn't just hide the past. It actively prevented thousands of veterans from getting answers about their own health problems or from even applying for disability benefits. And you'd think, okay, this must all be in the past, right? Well, not exactly. As recently as 2016, a report found that many crucial documents about these tests are still classified. This makes it incredibly difficult for scientists and doctors to fully understand the long-term health consequences for everyone who is exposed. So this whole dark history leaves us with a really fundamental question, one that doesn't have an easy answer. At what point does the excuse of national security stop being a good enough reason for all this secrecy? And how does a government ever make things right with the very citizens it harmed in the name of protecting them?